I want to do a quick recap of some of the books that I read this year, mostly just focusing on the stuff that I read that I really enjoyed. So first up, the Alien, the role-playing game from Free League. I read this book. I loved this book. I got a chance to actually play Alien. A friend of mine ran Alien for a little bit, and it was great. I really, really enjoyed this. This is a science fiction game I'm going to be revisiting for sure. I'm giving serious thought to using this game mechanic if I run 2300 AD, which is an old 80s science fiction setting that I always really enjoyed, that had rules that I found inscrutable, unreadable, probably unplayable. I don't know. Maybe people enjoyed it. I would not be one of those people. So I'm thinking very hard about using Alien, because I think it captures exactly the right mood and the right level of mechanics, which is not that much, for what I want from a science fiction, a more real world, that's not the right word I'm looking for, a lower key science fiction. You know, the science fiction of Alien, but also of Outland and movies like that, and TV shows like The Expanse. So I think that Alien's going to be very important to me coming up. And I had a blast playing it, and it was a really good book to read. It has some beautiful interior art and some design. Maybe it's a little bit over-designed, but I still think that overall it's pretty cool. I mean, there's not a ton of information per page, which can be a little frustrating if you want a little bit more efficiency, but I do think that there's a lot of really good information. I think that it's well presented, and I think this is a really good game. I'm very excited to come back to this in the future. So, on to some other stuff. Now, if you've been following this channel at all, you know that I have been having a ton of fun recently with Dungeon Crawl Classics over the last couple of years. And so with that, I read through the Gongfarmer's Almanac for 2018 and the Gongfarmer's Almanac Volume 1 and 2 for 2019. Tons of great stuff in these. If you are into Dungeon Crawl Classics, this is a fantastic resource. You can get them in print fairly cheap from Lulu. You can get them free as PDFs from DriveThruRPG. And again, if you are into DCC, you should be getting these. Are you going to use all of it? No, absolutely not. But you're going to find stuff in these. You are going to find stuff in these tomes full of crazy information, and it's all that DIY stuff that is so cool. I guess it's big in the OSR, which I don't consider myself really involved in. I don't quite tap into that at all, but it's that DIY thing of like the early 80s that was really big in the RPGs in the early 80s when nobody really knew what they were doing, so they just did what made sense for their group. But now on a bigger stage, thanks to the internet and all of that. So very cool. And keeping with DCC, I also really enjoyed reading Hubris, which is a setting book that is full of very useful charts that I think will serve me well in the future. Even if I don't necessarily use Hubris, it will serve me well in the future running some DCC. I think a very cool book. Also, if you're into Dungeon Crawl Classics, I would recommend getting this. I could see these charts being useful beyond Dungeon Crawl Classics pretty easily, because there's a lot of system agnostic stuff in here. So just if you're into like fantasy RPGs, this might be worth checking out. So anyway, Hubris, very cool. So on to my favorite RPG. I read a lot of stuff for Call of Cthulhu this year. Most importantly, I finally got and read 7th edition. I've been thinking about it, kicking it around. Part of me was like, well, what do I really need a new edition for? I've been using 5th for years and years and years, and I've really enjoyed it. Do I really need another edition? Yeah, did I really need another? I don't know if I did, but I decided to grab Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. It's the first real major change that this game has ever really made. That's more than just aesthetics and organization and that sort of thing. I feel like this is Still not a huge change, but it's a bigger change than they've made before. If you're thinking about getting Call of Cthulhu, all you need is Keeper's rulebook. This has everything you need, period. Everything you need is right in here. If you want, there's more information that's very handy in the Investigator's Handbook to expand stuff, but this is expansion. It is not necessary. Everything you need is in this one book. Now, following along with that, I also ended up checking out this magazine, Beit El-Azif, which is for both Call of Cthulhu and for Trail of Cthulhu. So that when there's stats, they do stats for both games. Trail of Cthulhu being part of the Gumshoe system. It's an alternate way of running Cthulhu-type scenarios, a different system. There are things I like, there are things I don't about it. I have played very little Gumshoe. I think that there's some cool aspects to it, but I also am a little wonkadoo on it as well, so we'll see. But I also have to try it more before I can really say one way or another. However, it doesn't really matter because there's Call of Cthulhu stats in here if you care about stats. But really, more importantly, it has some cool articles, some cool adventures, and it just reminds me of the early days of The Unspeakable Oath, which was such a great magazine I loved getting copies of back in the 90s. I think it's still kind of kicking around. I'm never really sure. I kind of feel like it was out of print for a long time or out of circulation for a long time, that kept coming back. I don't really understand exactly what's going on there. But the early days of Unspeakable Oath were great. And the last issue I bought, which was, again, I think in the 90s, was not great. And I think that's part of why I stopped. But Beit El-Azif reminds me of that. So continuing with Call of Cthulhu, I read a lot of Call of Cthulhu this year. So I also read Pulp Cthulhu. This is a rules expansion for making your Call of Cthulhu game really, really pulpy. Variations of that. I would argue that most published adventures and campaigns for Call of Cthulhu from day one have leaned heavily into the pulpy side of things. There's not a lot of them that, to me, genuinely capture Lovecraftian horror. Most of them have a very pulpy vibe with horror added in. That said, because I wrote my own stuff, I feel like some of the stuff I wrote maybe leaned a little bit more into Lovecraftian horror, although to be honest, my stuff was probably pretty pulpy too. This lets you just say, you know what, I'm going to play a pulp adventure. I've got a bunch of people, they're going to have some blazing, two-fisted adventures fighting the mythos. Great. Fantastic. Have fun with it. This is how I'm probably, if I ever sit down and run Masks of Nyarlathotep or Horror on the Orient Express, I'm probably going to use Pulp Cthulhu. I feel like especially Masks is such a pulpy kind of campaign. Here we go. Pulp Cthulhu. This, again, not everything you need. This is an expansion for the Keeper rulebook. You need the Keeper rulebook, which is all you need to run Call of Cthulhu. If you want to do Pulp, this has got you covered to add to that. So along with Pulp Cthulhu, I read this campaign, Cold Fire Within. This is a Pulp Cthulhu campaign, which I have done a larger video about. I'm not 100% sure if it'll be posted at the point when this video goes up, but if it isn't, it'll be posted soon. I'm not sure the order they're going up in. So I read this. I have now actually run this. My first full-length Call of Cthulhu published campaign that I have ever run. Again, I'll have a video about it, so you'll see how that went in that video. But I read this, and I really enjoyed reading this. I think it's really neat. It has some very cool art. And, yep, so that was all stuff that I read for tabletop RPGs this year that I really enjoyed. I also read a little bit in the way of fiction that I really enjoyed. I read the first 3 books in Glenn Cook's Black Company series. I had heard about it for years. I'd seen it on the shelf when I worked in a bookstore, but I never read it. Fantasy, generally speaking, not my bag. But somebody, I'm not going to be, beat around the bush. It was Matt Colville. I watched a lot of Matt Colville videos, and he talked frequently about the Black Company and how it was profoundly inspirational for him in the stuff that he ran. D&D, not my bag. Fantasy, not really my bag. But I like Coville's videos. I find him I find him a really interesting character. I think that he has a ton of advice that translates beyond Dungeons and Dragons, beyond fantasy. He has a lot of really good advice and a lot of interesting opinions on things that I think are worthy of seeking out and listening to. He's got a really interesting way of looking at a lot of stuff. So I figured, what the heck? I will give Black Company a try, and I ended up really enjoying it. I don't know the history. I certainly don't know a lot of post-Tolkien fantasy. I don't know the history of the genre and how all these little subgenres have poked out over the time. I do remember in the late 80s through the 90s, I remember lots and lots and lots of fantasy about women with cats. I remember that was a big thing. And I do know about the whole Death of Trees fiction, which is, all those, that the series of 20 books that every one of them is 450, 500 pages long, and they're just interminable books. I feel like started with John Norman. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Went on through like David Eddings and George R.R. Martin and all that. I didn't follow any of that. I don't know any of that. I haven't read any of that. I tried reading a couple of them. I tried reading Sarah Douglas. It was terrible. I did read the first Killer Chronicles book, which I was surprised at how much I liked. But again, fantasy, not my normal thing. Reading Black Company, I really enjoyed it. The first book particularly, to me, felt like a fantasy version of Vietnam War journals, which was really an odd thing. But anyhow, I found it really fascinating. I don't know the history of the genre. I don't know the modern history of the genre, but I feel like the whole grimdark thing, the Warhammer fantasy, and all the stuff that kind of came after that, it really feels like Glenn Cook is foundational to that. From when those books came out and when the other stuff came out after, I feel like it was a response to Cook's work. I could be wrong. Maybe there's something before Cook that it's referencing. I really don't know. But Cook definitely feels like early grimdark and maybe foundational grimdark fiction. Grimdark, not necessarily my cup of tea, but it was a good read. And all three books, each book was a little different, following the same characters and everything, but the plots were different and the structure even was different. And I found it a really compelling thing. I am contemplating reading further. If I get a chance, I may pick up the next set of books. I've heard mixed reviews, so I don't know. But the first three books, though, I would definitely recommend that trilogy. It is available at, I don't know if it's still in print, but it's certainly, you can get it in those first three books as a trilogy thing. I also read a book, I think it's book 7 of E.C. Tubbs' Doomerest series, called Technos. I really, really like the E.C. Tubb books, the Doomerest of Terra novels. My dad used to talk to me about them when I was a kid. He used to tell me about them a bunch, and it always sounded really fascinating, but I didn't find them. I didn't read them. I don't remember how or why, but I never got into them. And then years ago, I managed to get the first 4 books in an omnibus edition that ended up being the only omnibus done. They didn't come back and do the rest of the series, and there's like 35 of them, I think. So I have been slowly getting them as ebooks and reading them whenever I need a break from anything too heavy. Now, they're not cheesy. They're short, really tight, really well-written little sci-fi space opera adventure novels. In talking about tabletop RPGs, they're like traveler stories, but like not from the same perspective that a lot of traveler stuff is maybe normally from. So I really, really enjoy the Doomerest of Terra books. I only read one this year, but it was Technos, and it was really good. So that was the fiction I read, and then I also read, for nonfiction, this book here, which is 111 Places in Women's History in Washington, D.C. that you must not miss. This was a really solid book. It's got a ton of really good information. I love Washington, D.C. I live just outside of Washington, D.C. This is like my chosen home. I came here, it's not 15 years ago, but it's coming up on 15 years soon, and I fell in love. I love this city. I love living in this area. And so this has a lot of stuff that I found really interesting. Now, you can take that with a grain of salt. My wife co-wrote this, so I certainly have a reason to be as enthusiastic as I am. However, that said, if you're traveling to DC and you're into women's history, which you should be, because there's a ton of great women's history in DC, this is a really good book to check out. I like it not only because it deals with some of the historic stuff all over the spectrum of politics and science and art and all that sort of thing, but then it also has recommendations. So, if you're at a site about a certain thing, there's recommendations for other places nearby, women-owned businesses or what have you, other things to see or restaurants to try or stores to check out, all that sort of thing. So it's 111, but then it's got a ton of other stuff in it. So I think really solid book. So that is my my reading from this past year. 2001, obviously, everybody's probably having a really strange year. I certainly have, but I did get a ton of tabletop RPGs read. I got some more. I read other stuff during the time. I did read a few other books that I didn't necessarily love so much, so I'm not going to bother to bring them up on here. But this is some of my favorite stuff from the year, my little retrospective. So thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you later.